The fluorescent lights of the morgue do not honor the dead, especially those classified as indigent. Lee Aaker's body lay in cold storage for weeks, a forgotten item on the county's inventory because he died penniless, leaving behind only debt and silence. There was no entourage, no bank account, just the crushing weight of a bankruptcy that had slowly consumed him since childhood, leaving him to rot as an anonymous John Doe in the middle of the desert. It is hard to reconcile this grim reality with the vibrant boy who once stormed the screen in The Adventures of Rin Tin Tin. But his fate was sealed the moment the applause stopped. Hollywood is a machine that eats its young. When the ratings dropped, Disney and the studios turned their backs, offering no support and no guidance. The boy went from a national icon to a discarded asset, proving that in show business, love is always conditional. To understand how a national icon becomes an indigent decedent, one must look at the manufacturing process. Lee Aaker was not born. He was cast. He entered the world on September 25, 1943, in Inglewood, California. The location is significant. Inglewood was the backyard of the Dream Factory. It was where the mechanics, the grips, and the hopefuls lived. His mother, Mrs. Aaker, was a woman of specific ambition. She owned a dance school. In the ecosystem of 1940s Los Angeles, a dance school was a recruitment center. Mothers brought their children to learn tap and ballet, but they were really buying a lottery ticket. They wanted their children to be seen. Mrs. Aaker did not need to look far for her candidate. She looked at her son. Lee was a handsome child. He had the post-war look that Hollywood craved. Blonde hair, round face, eyes that conveyed a natural, unforced sincerity. He was not precocious in the annoying theatrical way. He was grounded. He looked like the boy next door, if the boy next door was ready to hit a mark and memorize lines. His mother began the process of professionalization before he could read. She did not ask him if he wanted to be an actor. The question was irrelevant. The child was an asset. The asset needed to be deployed. Lee was enrolled in classes. He was taught to sing. He was taught to dance. He was taught that affection was conditional on performance. If he did well, his mother was happy. If he booked a job, the household was stable. The inner life of Lee Aaker at age 8 was a conflict zone. He wanted to play. He wanted to be invisible. He wanted the dirt and noise of a normal boyhood. But the external pressure was absolute. He was dragged to auditions. He sat in waiting rooms filled with hundreds of other boys who looked exactly like him. He learned early that he was replaceable. He learned that he had to be better, faster, and more charming than the blonde kid sitting next to him. His breakout came not from comedy, but from the high stakes of drama. In 1952, the director Fred Zinnemann was casting for a Western. The film was High Noon. It starred Gary Cooper. It was a serious, grim deconstruction of the Western myth. Zinnemann needed a face that represented innocence in a town full of cowards. He saw Lee. Lee appeared uncredited, but he was seen. He was on set. He watched Gary Cooper. He learned the discipline of the set. Silence when the red light is on. Do what the man with the megaphone says. Do not complain. This led to Hondo in 1953. This was the big leagues. The star was John Wayne, the Duke, the physical embodiment of American masculinity. Lee Aaker was 10 years old. He was cast as the son of the female lead. The role required him to be tough. It required him to be thrown around. There is a scene in Hondo where John Wayne tosses the boy into a river to teach him to swim. It was not a stunt double. It was Lee. The water was cold. The fear was real. But Lee did not cry. He swam. He understood the transaction. John Wayne was the boss. If the boss threw you in the river, you swam. If you complained, you were fired. If you were fired, you failed your mother. John Wayne liked the kid. He saw a professional. He saw a boy who didn't need to be coddled. This approval was a drug. It validated the loss of his childhood. Being treated like a man by John Wayne felt like a fair trade for missing Little League. But films were gig work. You worked for 3 months, then you were unemployed. Mrs. Aaker wanted stability. She wanted a contract. She wanted a television show. Television in 1954 was the new frontier. It was the Wild West of capitalism. Studios were scrambling to fill airtime. Screen Gems, the television arm of Columbia Pictures, had secured the rights to a property that had been dormant for years. Rin Tin Tin. The original Rin Tin Tin was a silent movie star, a dog who saved Warner Brothers from bankruptcy in the 1920s. But that dog was dead. The legacy remained. Screen Gems decided to reboot the franchise for the small screen. They needed a German Shepherd and they needed a boy. The casting call went out. Hundreds of boys auditioned. They were looking for a specific archetype: the orphan, the survivor, the boy who could hold his own against the harshness of the frontier but still needed the protection of the cavalry. Lee Aaker walked into the room. He had the resume. He had the John Wayne stamp of approval. But more importantly, he had the eyes. He could look at a dog and make the audience believe he loved it. He could look at a camera and make the audience want to adopt him. He got the part. The contract was signed. It was a standard studio contract for a minor in the 1950s. It gave the studio everything. It gave them his image, his name, his voice, and his future. In exchange, he received a weekly salary. It started at around $250 a week. In 1954, $250 was a significant sum. It was more than most men made working in factories. It was enough to buy a house, a car, a lifestyle. Lee Aaker, aged 11, became the primary breadwinner of his family. The power dynamic in the Aaker household shifted permanently. The father figure faded into the background. The mother became the manager. The son became the engine. Production began. The premise of the adventures of Rin Tin Tin was simple. Rusty, a boy orphaned by an Indian raid, a standard unexamined trope of the era, is found by the soldiers of Fort Apache in the Arizona Territory. He is adopted by the regiment. He is given a rank, honorary corporal. He has a dog, Rin Tin Tin, who is smarter than the humans and solves all the problems. It was a boy's fantasy brought to life. No parents, just soldiers, horses, guns, and a dog. But the reality of filming was a grind. They shot at the Corriganville Movie Ranch in Simi Valley. It was hot. It was dusty. The schedule was brutal. 6 days a week, early mornings, late nights. Lee Aaker ceased to be a child. He became a unit of production. He had to memorize pages of dialogue every night. He had to perform stunts. He had to work with a dog that, while trained, was still an animal. If the dog missed a mark, they reset. If the lighting was wrong, they reset. If Lee Aaker was tired, they did not reset. They gave him a pep talk and pushed him back in front of the lens. The show premiered on ABC on October 15th, 1954. It aired on Friday nights. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. It was not just a hit, it was a phenomenon. 8 million people tuned in every week. The ratings crushed the competition. Rusty and Rinty became the face of Friday night. Merchandising followed the ratings. This is where the true scale of the exploitation becomes visible. Screen Gems licensed the image of Lee Aaker. His face was everywhere. You could buy a Rusty uniform. You could buy a Rusty hat. You could buy a Rusty canteen. There were Rin Tin Tin comic books with Lee's face on the cover. There were lunch boxes. There were coloring books. There were puzzles. Millions of dollars in merchandise flowed into the coffers of Screen Gems. The studio executives bought new cars. They bought houses in the hills. They expanded their operations. Lee Aaker saw very little of this. His contract was for his acting services. He did not have points on the back end. He did not have merchandising rights. He was paid his salary, which eventually rose to $500 a week. It was a good wage, but it was a fraction of the value he was generating. He was a tangible asset, like a copper mine or an oil well. The studio mined his youth. They extracted his cuteness. They packaged his innocence and sold it to a nation terrified of the Cold War. Rusty represented safety. He represented a world where the good guys always won, where the moral lines were clear, and where a boy and his dog could save the day. Inside Lee's mind, a separation began to occur. There was Rusty, the brave corporal who rode horses and fought bad guys. And there was Lee, the tired boy who wanted to sleep, who wanted to play baseball, who wanted his mother to talk about something other than the next script. He was isolated. He didn't go to a normal school. He had a studio teacher on set. His peers were adults, the actors playing Lieutenant Masters and Sergeant O'Hara. He lived in an adult world, listening to adult conversations, dealing with adult pressures. He missed the socialization that forms a human personality. He didn't learn how to make friends his own age. He learned how to please producers. The fame was a cage. He couldn't go to the grocery store without being mobbed. Other children wanted to be him, or they wanted to fight him. He was a target. He learned to hide in plain sight. He learned to mistrust strangers. He learned that everyone wanted something from him, a signature, a photo, a moment of his time. But the most dangerous aspect of his life was the clock. Biology is the enemy of the child star. The studio needed Rusty to stay 10 years old forever. They needed the high voice. They needed the small stature. They needed the smooth face. Lee Aaker was human. He was aging. Every inch he grew was a threat to the franchise. Every time his voice cracked in rehearsal, a producer frowned. He was fighting a war against his own pituitary gland. By 1958, the strain was showing. Lee was 14. He was entering puberty. The writers had to jump through hoops to explain why a teenager was still hanging around a fort playing with a dog. They couldn't send him to the academy. That would end the show. They couldn't let him have a girlfriend. That would alienate the young audience. He was trapped in a state of arrested development, enforced by a contract. He had to bind his chest to look younger. He had to pitch his voice higher. He was performing a caricature of his younger self. It was humiliating. It was exhausting. The ratings began to slip. Not because the show was bad, but because the illusion was breaking. The audience could see that Rusty was becoming a man. And a man playing a boy is not a hero. It is a tragedy. Screen Gems saw the numbers. They saw the biology. They made a calculation. They didn't look for a way to transition Lee into adult roles. They didn't look for a spinoff. They looked at the bottom line. The asset was depreciating. The cost of maintenance was high. The solution was liquidation. In 1959, the order came down from the executive offices. Cancel the show. Lee Aaker was 15 years old. He had worked continuously for 5 years. He had generated millions. He had been the most famous boy in America. And in one afternoon, he was fired. There was no severance package. There was no thank you lunch. There was just a notification that production had ceased. The fort was struck. The costumes were returned to the wardrobe department. The dog went back to its trainer. Lee Aaker went home to Inglewood. He sat in his room. The phone, which had rung incessantly for 5 years, went silent. He looked in the mirror. He saw a teenager with a famous face and no job. He saw a product that had been pulled from the shelves. He didn't know it yet, but his life was effectively over. The first death of Lee Aaker had happened. The physical death would not come for another 62 years, but the spiritual death, the death of purpose, occurred the moment the camera stopped rolling. He was a retired general at 15, a veteran of a war that nobody remembered fighting. He had money in the bank, managed by his mother, but he had no skills for the real world. He didn't know how to be a student. He didn't know how to be a normal teenager. He was rusty, and rusty didn't exist anymore. The silence in the Aaker household in 1959 was heavy. For 5 years, the rhythm of the house had been dictated by the production schedule of Screen Gems. Wake up at dawn, drive to the ranch, shoot until sunset, repeat. Now, there was no schedule. There was only a teenager sitting in a living room in Inglewood, staring at a calendar that had suddenly gone blank. The cancellation of the adventures of Rin, Tintin, was not just a job loss, it was an identity crisis. Lee Aaker had spent his formative years being someone else. He had been a soldier. He had been a hero. Now, he was just Lee. And Lee did not know what to do with a Tuesday morning. The studio, however, had one final piece of business to conduct. The termination of the show did not automatically terminate the financial relationship. There were contracts to be settled. There were loose ends to be tied. Screen Gems was looking at the future of television syndication. They knew that Rin Tin Tin was a valuable library asset. Reruns cost nothing to produce but generated pure profit from advertisers. The standard contract for actors in the 1950s did not account for the explosion of residual income that was about to reshape the industry. The Screen Actors Guild was fighting for these rights, but for a child actor signed in 1954, the protections were weak. The studio wanted to own the show in perpetuity, without the annoyance of mailing checks to the cast every time an episode aired in Des Moines or Dallas. They summoned the Aaker family to a meeting. It was likely held in a wood-paneled office in Hollywood, the air conditioned to a chill, the atmosphere thick with corporate leverage. Lee was present, but he was a spectator. He was 15. He had no legal standing. His mother, Mrs. Aaker, and his agents sat across from the studio executives. The executives laid out the deal. It was a buyout. The concept is simple and predatory. The studio offers a lump sum payment, cash, right now. In exchange, the actor waives all rights to future residuals. They sign away their back-end participation. It is a gamble. If the show flops in reruns, the actor wins. If the show becomes a classic, the studio wins. Screen Gems offered $10,000. In 1959, $10,000 was a tangible, heavy amount of money. It could buy 2 new Cadillacs. It could buy a modest 3-bedroom house in the suburbs. To a family that had grown accustomed to a steady paycheck but feared the sudden drought of unemployment, it looked like a safety net. It looked like security. The agents likely advised them to take it. Agents work on commission. A lump sum means a quick 15%. Residuals are a slow trickle that might not be worth the paperwork. The pressure in the room was designed to force a signature. Take the money, kid. It's the best you're going to get. Mrs. Aaker signed. Lee watched his future being sold. He didn't understand the economics of syndication. He didn't know that Rin Tin Tin would air in English, French, German, and Spanish for the next 40 years. He didn't know that the show would generate millions of dollars in pure profit for Screen Gems. He just saw the check. The deal was closed. Lee Aaker walked out of that office with $10,000 and zero ownership of the work that had consumed his childhood. He had been liquidated. The immediate aftermath was a period of delusion. Lee and his mother believed that the Rusty fame would translate into a film career. He was recognizable. He was talented. He had worked with Zinnemann and Wayne. Surely the phone would ring. He entered the audition circuit. This is the specific hell of the former child star. He walked into rooms filled with casting directors who remembered him as a cute 10-year-old. They looked at the 15-year-old standing in front of them and recoiled. Puberty had been unkind to the brand. Lee was short. He had a round face that retained a childish softness, but his body was thickening. His voice had dropped, but it lacked the resonance of a leading man. He was trapped in the uncanny valley of adolescence. He wasn't a boy, and he wasn't a man. He was a visual contradiction. "You're too short," they said. "You look too young," they said. "You're rusty," they said. The typecasting was absolute. When he read for a dramatic role, the producers couldn't see the character. They saw the kid from the cavalry. They feared the audience would laugh. Look, it's Rusty trying to be a tough guy. The suspension of disbelief was impossible because his face was too famous. He managed to book a few guest spots. He appeared on the Donna Reed show. He appeared on Route 66. These were favors or stunt casting. They were not the beginning of a second act. They were the echoes of the first. On the set of the Donna Reed show, he met Paul Peterson. Peterson was a current teen idol playing Jeff Stone. He looked at Lee Aaker and saw a ghost of Christmas future. Peterson recognized the look in Lee's eyes, the desperation, the confusion. They were members of the same fraternity, soldiers in a war that used children as ammunition. But even Peterson couldn't save him. Lee did his lines, took his check, and left. By 1960, the reality of his financial situation began to bite. The $10,000 was finite. The money earned during the Rin Tin Tin years had been spent. Taxes took a chunk. Agent fees took a chunk. Living expenses, the house, the car, the lifestyle expected of a star, ate the rest. The Coogan Law, enacted in 1939 to protect child actors' earnings, required that 15% of a minor's gross income be set aside in a blocked trust. But in the 1950s, the law was toothless. There was little oversight. Parents often found ways to access the funds, justifying it as care and maintenance of the child. It is unclear exactly how much was left in Lee's trust when he turned 21, but later interviews suggest it was negligible. He did not step into adulthood with a fortune. He stepped into it with empty pockets. He tried to diversify. He looked at the music industry. Teen idols like Ricky Nelson and Paul Anka were making millions singing rock and roll. Lee had no musical training, but that hadn't stopped others. He tried to package himself. It failed. The public didn't want to hear Rusty sing. He looked at Disney. He had a history there. He had appeared in the Spin and Marty serials on the Mickey Mouse Club. Disney was a factory that reused its assets. But the Disney of the early 60s was moving on. They were looking for the next generation. They were grooming Kurt Russell. They had no use for a relic from the 50s. The mouse was a business, not a charity. The rejection from Disney was particularly stinging. It reinforced the message, you are obsolete. As the rejections mounted, the relationship between Lee and his mother deteriorated. Mrs. Aaker had been the architect of his career. She had pushed him. She had managed him. Now that the machine was broken, the resentment surfaced. Lee began to question the decision she had made. Why did she sign the buyout? Why didn't she save more money? Why didn't she let him have a childhood? The house in Inglewood became a pressure cooker of blame. Lee felt used. He felt that his mother loved the star, not the son. When the star died, the love seemed to evaporate, replaced by anxiety about bills. He needed to escape. He needed to find a place where he wasn't Lee Aaker, the failed actor. In 1962, at the age of 18, he made a pivot that was both desperate and logical. He looked for a different kind of uniform. He left Hollywood. He joined the United States Air Force. It was a radical move. He traded the chaotic, ego-driven hierarchy of a film set for the rigid, anonymous hierarchy of the military. In the Air Force, no one cared about ratings. No one cared about close-ups. They cared about following orders and making your bed. For a young man who had been told what to do his entire life, the military was a comfortable fit. It offered structure. It offered food and housing. It offered a paycheck that didn't depend on his smile. He served his time. He was stationed at various bases. He kept his head down. He didn't brag about his past, but he couldn't escape it completely. Other airmen would recognize him. "Hey, aren't you the kid with the dog?" The question was a torment. It reminded him of what he had lost. It turned him into a novelty act in the barracks. He learned to deflect. He learned to deny. No, just look like him. He began the process of erasing his own history. He left the Air Force in the mid-60s. He returned to civilian life. He returned to Los Angeles. It was a mistake. Los Angeles in 1965 was a different planet than the one he had left. The studio system was collapsing. The counterculture was rising. The Sunset Strip was filled with long-haired musicians and protesters. The clean-cut, wholesome image of Rusty was not just outdated, it was the enemy. He represented the establishment. He represented the lie of the 50s. He tried to act again. It was a reflex. It was the only profession he knew. He went to auditions. But now he was a veteran. He was in his early 20s. He had a gap in his resume, and he still looked like Rusty. The final blow came in a producer's office in 1966. The details of the meeting are lost, but the outcome was definitive. The producer told him the truth, not the polite Hollywood, "we went in a different direction," but the brutal truth. "You have no future here, Lee. Go do something else." Lee Aaker walked out of that office and kept walking. He walked away from the sound stages. He walked away from the agents. He walked away from the dream that had been forced upon him. He was 23 years old. He was a has-been. He was uneducated. He had no trade skills. He had no college degree. He looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had pretended to work for a living. He decided he needed to learn how to actually work. He found a job as a carpenter's apprentice. It was a humiliation, and it was a salvation. Starting at the bottom, he hauled lumber and swept sawdust, trading scripts for blueprints and applause for the swing of a hammer. The physical labor was punishing, breaking his body down even as it began to rebuild his mind. There is an honesty in carpentry. If you cut a board too short, it is too short. You can't fix it in post-production. You can't charm your way out of a crooked wall. He liked the solitude. He liked the noise of the saw drowning out the thoughts in his head. But Los Angeles is a cruel city. It is small. The worlds of the working class and the celebrity class overlap. As he gained skill, he began working on high-end renovations. He worked on houses in Beverly Hills and Bel Air. He worked on the homes of producers and directors. There were moments of excruciating irony. Lee Aaker, tool belt around his waist, walking through the living room of a mansion owned by a studio executive. He would see the awards on the mantle. He would see the scripts on the table. He was a servant in the palace he used to rule. He prayed for invisibility. He wore a hat. He grew a mustache. He avoided eye contact, but sometimes recognition was inevitable. "You look familiar," a homeowner would say. Lee would freeze. He had a choice: admit it or lie. Usually he lied. I get that a lot. But occasionally, the homeowner would push. "No, I know you. You're the kid from Rin Tin Tin." The reaction was always the same: pity. "Oh, you're a carpenter now?" The unspoken sentence hung in the air. What went wrong? They didn't see the dignity in the work. They saw failure. In Hollywood, if you are not on screen, you do not exist. To go from star to laborer is to fall off the edge of the world. Lee would nod, finish his work, and leave. He would take the check. He needed the money. But the shame burned. It drove him to the bottle. Alcohol became his anesthesia. It was cheap. It was available. It dulled the memory of the applause. He wasn't an angry drunk like some. He was a sad drunk. He drank to turn off the movie playing in his head. He tried to build a personal life. He met Sharon Ann Ritchie. They fell in love. They married. For a brief window, he thought he could be normal. He could be a husband. He could have a family. But he was damaged goods. He didn't know how to communicate. He carried the weight of his failure into the marriage. He was emotionally unavailable. The marriage lasted 2 years. They divorced. He was alone again. He drifted. He worked odd jobs. He taught skiing in the winters at Mammoth Mountain. This was a bright spot. He was good at it. He worked with children, specifically children with disabilities. On the slopes, he wasn't rusty. He was Lee, the instructor. He was patient. He was kind. He found a redemption in helping kids who were struggling with their own bodies. He saw their courage, and it gave him perspective. But the seasons changed. The snow melted. He had to go back to the city, back to the carpentry, back to the anonymity. By the 1980s, the nostalgia boom began. Cable television needed content. Rin Tin Tin returned to the airwaves. A whole new generation of children discovered Rusty. Lee would be flipping channels in his small apartment and see himself. He would see the boy saluting. He would hear the bugle call. He would calculate the math. The show was running in prime slots on cable. The advertising rates were high. Someone was making a fortune. He checked his mailbox. Nothing. The $10,000 buyout from 1959 was an iron door. He was locked out of his own legacy. He contacted Screen Gems. He asked if there was anything, a goodwill payment, a royalty for merchandise. The answer was a legal letter. Referred to the contract of 1959. All rights waived. It was legal, but it felt criminal. Lee Aaker stopped watching TV. He stopped telling people who he was. He decided that Lee Aaker, the actor, was dead. He buried him deep inside Lee Aaker, the carpenter. He grew older. The physical labor took a toll. His back hurt. His knees hurt. He developed health issues. He didn't have a Screen Actors Guild pension because he hadn't worked enough as an adult to qualify. He didn't have a robust union pension from carpentry because his work had been sporadic. He was approaching 60, and he was staring at poverty. He looked at Los Angeles, the traffic, the cost of rent, the ghosts on every corner. He decided to leave. He couldn't afford to die in the city where he was born. He packed his tools. He packed his few clothes. He got in his car and drove east. He headed for the desert, Arizona, a place where the heat burns everything clean, a place where you can be a nobody. He was retreating. He was surrendering. He was looking for a place to lay down his burden. Mesa, Arizona, is a city built on the concept of dry heat and quiet endings. It is a sprawl of beige stucco strip malls and retirement communities where the elderly go to stretch their fixed incomes against the rising cost of living. For Lee Aaker, it was the perfect hiding place. He arrived in the desert not as a conquering hero, but as a refugee from his own history. He was looking for anonymity, and Mesa sold it cheap. The apartment he found was small. It was functional. It was the kind of place rented by people who pay in cash or money orders. The walls were thin, vibrating with the sounds of neighbors' televisions and arguments. The view from the window was not the Hollywood Hills or the Santa Monica coastline. It was a parking lot, asphalt radiating heat, lined with cars that had seen better decades. Lee Aaker was in his 50s when he settled in. He was still strong, carrying the muscle memory of his years as a carpenter, but the body was beginning to rebel. The years of hauling lumber, of climbing ladders, of drinking cheap whiskey to numb the silence, were collecting their toll. His life in Arizona was defined by a brutal mathematical simplicity. He lived on a fixed income. He had a small pension from the carpenters' union, fractured by years of sporadic employment. He had Social Security. The total monthly intake was roughly $1,500. $1,500. This was the sum of his existence. It had to cover rent. It had to cover utilities. It had to cover food. It had to cover the whiskey. There was no margin for error. There was no budget for luxury. And there was certainly no budget for the past. In Los Angeles, Lee had been a has-been. In Mesa, he was a never was. The neighbors saw an aging man in a baseball cap and worn-out jeans. They saw him walk to the mailbox. They saw him carry groceries. They did not see Rusty. They did not see the boy who had once commanded the attention of 8 million people. The disconnect was absolute. Lee preferred it this way. Recognition in a grocery store in Mesa would not bring applause. It would bring questions he could not answer. Why are you here? Why aren't you rich? What happened? He built a routine around invisibility. He woke up early, a habit from the studio days that never died. He drank coffee. He watched the news. He avoided the entertainment channels. He didn't want to know who won the Oscars. He didn't want to know which child star was currently melting down on the tabloids. That world was a distant planet, a place he had been exiled from without a trial. His relationship with his mother, Mrs. Aaker, the architect of his rise and the signatory of his fall, had dissolved into silence. She remained in California, holding on to the memories of the golden boy. Lee held onto the reality of the broken man. The resentment over the 1959 buyout contract had calcified into a hard, cold rock in his chest. He didn't scream about it anymore. He didn't fight about it. He just let the silence grow until it was a wall that could not be breached. He felt she had failed to protect him. She felt he had failed to appreciate her. They were both right, and they were both wrong, but the tragedy was that they stopped speaking. The isolation was self-imposed, but it was also a product of the gig economy of Hollywood. In a traditional career, you build a network. You have colleagues. You have a pension plan. You have a gold watch at retirement. In the entertainment industry, when you are done, you are erased. The people Lee had worked with, the directors, the producers, the other actors, had moved on. They were dead, or they were rich, or they were like him, hiding in their own corners of obscurity. He had no children. The divorce from Sharon years earlier had closed that door. There was no one to visit him on Sundays, no one to ask for stories about John Wayne. The lineage of Lee Aaker ended with Lee Aaker. As the years in Arizona ground on, a new enemy appeared. It was not a studio executive. It was not a bad contract. It was his own biology. The stroke hit him without warning. It is a cruel irony that the boy known for his physical agility, the boy who did his own stunts, who swam rivers and rode horses, was betrayed by his own nervous system. The stroke stripped him of his mobility. It took the carpenter's hands and made them shake. It took the soldier's stride and turned it into a shuffle. He survived, but he was diminished. The circle of his world shrank. He could no longer work odd jobs for extra cash. He could no longer ski. He was confined to the apartment. The walls moved closer. Medical care in America is a business. It requires capital. Lee Aaker had none. He was a veteran of the Air Force, which gave him access to the VA system, but the VA is a bureaucracy that requires patience and advocacy. Lee had patience, but he had no advocate. He navigated the system alone. He waited in lines. He filled out forms with shaking hands. He accepted the minimum standard of care because he couldn't afford anything else. He was prescribed medication, painkillers for the back, thinners for the blood, pills to regulate a heart that had beaten too fast for too long. The pharmacy counter became his new casting call. He stood in line, waiting for his name, hoping the copay wouldn't break him for the month. During this period of decline, the nostalgia industry was booming. The internet had arrived. eBay was selling Rin Tin Tin memorabilia for hundreds of dollars. A vintage lunchbox with Lee's face on it could sell for $300, 20% of his monthly income. Strangers were buying and selling pieces of his life, trading his childhood like stocks. Lee saw none of this profit. He didn't own the lunchbox. He didn't own the image. He was the raw material, discarded after the extraction was complete. Occasionally, a fan would track him down. The internet made hiding difficult. Letters would arrive at the apartment in Mesa, photos to sign, memories shared. You were my hero. I watched you every Friday. You made my childhood better. Lee would read them. Sometimes he would sign. Sometimes he would throw them away. The letters were painful. They were addressed to Rusty. They were addressed to a ghost. The person reading them was an old man with a bad back and an empty refrigerator. The dissonance was physically painful. To acknowledge the fan was to acknowledge the distance between who he was and who he had become. He began to drink more. It was the only way to bridge the gap. Alcohol softened the edges of the apartment. It made the silence less aggressive. It was a slow suicide, conducted in private, one bottle at a time. He wasn't raging against the dying of the light. He was simply turning down the dimmer switch. There were other former child stars who had found a second life on the convention circuit. They went to autograph shows. They sat at tables in hotel ballrooms, charging $20 for a signature, telling old stories to graying fans. Paul Peterson, his old acquaintance from the Donna Reed show, had built a network. He ran a minor consideration, a group dedicated to helping former child actors. Peterson tried to find Lee. He knew the trajectory. He knew the risks. He wanted to bring Lee into the fold to offer support to maybe get him some convention money. But Lee Aaker didn't want to be found. He didn't want to sit at a table and be pitied. He didn't want to be a curiosity. He had his pride. It was a carpenter's pride. You don't ask for handouts. You don't sell your past. You stand on your own 2 feet, even if those feet are failing you. He dodged the calls. He ignored the outreach. He chose the dignity of silence over the humiliation of charity. The 2000s turned into the 2000s. Lee entered his 70s. The isolation became absolute. His neighbors changed. Transients moved in and out of the complex. Nobody knew the old man in 4B. Nobody asked. His health deteriorated further. He developed issues with his lungs. Breathing became a labor. The asthma that had plagued him as a fat kid in Inglewood returned, compounded by age and environment. He spent days in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the air conditioner. He was dying by degrees. There is a specific horror to poverty and old age. It is the loss of agency. You cannot choose what you eat what is cheap. You cannot choose where you go where the bus takes you. You cannot choose your doctors. You take who is assigned. Lee Aaker, who had once been flown first class by Columbia Pictures, who had been chauffeured to movie premieres, was now calculating the cost of a bus ticket to the pharmacy. He was living in the indigent gap. He wasn't homeless, so he didn't qualify for street services. But he was destitute, so he couldn't afford help. He was in the gray zone, the invisible stratum of American society, where the elderly quietly disappear. One afternoon, sifting through a box of fading documents, his fingers might have brushed against the yellowed pages of the 1959 contract, the paper that traded a lifetime of residuals for a fleeting safety net. He could have burned it. He could have torn it up, but he kept it. Not for the money it represented, but as the only tangible proof that he had once been worth something. Even if the number was a lie, the signature was real. He looked at his signature, the handwriting of a 15-year-old boy. He traced the letters. He tried to remember what that boy felt: hope, fear, ambition. He couldn't remember. That boy was a stranger. That boy had died in an office in Hollywood 60 years ago. The man in the apartment was just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. By 2021, the world was in the grip of a pandemic. The isolation of the elderly became a global mandate. For Lee, it changed nothing. He had been social distancing for decades. He was already in quarantine from the world of the living. He stopped going out. He stopped answering the door. He became a shadow in his own home. The end was approaching, and he knew it. He didn't write a memoir. He didn't call the New York Times. He didn't reach out to Disney. He simply waited. He had played his part. He had hit his marks. The scene was over. The director had yelled "cut" a lifetime ago, and Lee Aaker was finally ready to leave the set. The year 2020 arrived in Mesa, Arizona with a silence that matched the silence inside Lee Aaker's apartment. The world outside shut down. The pandemic closed the casinos, the restaurants, and the parks. For the general population, this was a shock to the system, a sudden contraction of life. For Lee Aaker, it was business as usual. He had been living in lockdown for decades. The quarantine mandates merely formalized the isolation he had already perfected. His apartment, a small unit in a complex that catered to those on the margins of the economy, became a sealed vessel. The walls were beige stucco, absorbing the desert heat by day and radiating it at night. The air conditioner was a window unit that rattled like a dying engine, fighting a losing war against the Arizona sun. Inside, the geography of his life was reduced to a few critical waypoints: the bed, the bathroom, the kitchenette, and the chair in front of the television. At 76, Lee Aaker was a man under siege by his own physiology. The stroke he had suffered years prior had left residual damage. His balance was compromised. His hands, once steady enough to build houses and guide horses, now trembled with a persistent tremor. Navigating the small apartment required strategy. He moved from furniture piece to furniture piece, using the back of a sofa or the edge of a counter as a stabilizer. A fall in this environment was not just an injury, it was a potential death sentence. There was no one to hear him scream. There was no one to help him up. His connection to the outside world was severed. He stopped driving. The car, an older model sedan that sat baking in the asphalt lot, became a storage unit for dust. He relied on grocery delivery or the kindness of neighbors he barely spoke to. The interactions were transactional and brief. A nod in the hallway, a mumbled thanks for a package. He wore a mask not just for safety, but for anonymity. It covered the face that had once been famous, leaving only the tired eyes of an old man visible. The financial pressure was a constant low-frequency hum. The stimulus checks sent out by the government were a lifeline. They covered the rent increases. They paid for the medication that kept his heart rhythm steady. But they did not buy comfort. Lee lived on the razor's edge of solvency. One major repair, one hospital stay not covered by the VA, and he would fall off the map entirely. He spent his days in a loop of memory and distraction. The television was his window. He watched the news. He watched the world arguing about masks and viruses. He watched the entertainment shows discussing the latest celebrity scandals. He saw the industry that had discarded him struggling to produce content. He felt no schadenfreude, only a distant recognition of the chaos. He thought about the contract, the 1959 buyout, $10,000. He adjusted for inflation in his head. He calculated the millions Screen Gems had made. He didn't do this with rage anymore. The rage had burned out. leaving only a cold, hard fact. He had been a raw material, like lumber, like copper. He had been extracted, processed, and sold. Now the mine was empty and the company had moved on. His health began to decline rapidly in early 2021. It wasn't a dramatic event. It was a slow erosion. Breathing became difficult. His lungs, scarred by years of smoking, and the asthma that had plagued his childhood, struggled to oxygenate his blood. He grew weaker. The walk to the bathroom became a marathon. He lost his appetite. The food in the refrigerator went bad. He didn't call a doctor. To call a doctor meant logistics. It meant transportation. It meant copays. It meant exposing himself to a hospital system overwhelmed by the virus. He decided to wait it out. He had survived the rejection of Hollywood. He had survived the humiliation of the construction sites. He believed he could survive this. He was wrong. On April 1st, 2021, the systems finally failed. There is no record of his final thoughts. There is no diary entry. There was no dramatic monologue delivered to an empty room. Death, when it came for Lee Aaker, was quiet. It was likely a moment of dizziness, a shortness of breath, a fading of the light. He was alone. The television might have been on, filling the room with the blue light of a soap opera or a commercial. He collapsed. The heart that had beaten for 77 years stopped. The brain that held the memories of John Wayne and Fred Zinnemann shut down. The apartment was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the noise from the TV. He lay there for some time. The exact duration is unknown. This is the hallmark of the solitary death. The clock keeps ticking for the world, but it stops for the room. The mail continues to arrive. The sun continues to rise. But the tenant has vacated the premises. Discovery came not from a friend or a family member, but from the bureaucracy of landlords. Perhaps the rent was late. Perhaps a neighbor noticed the mail piling up. Perhaps there was a smell. Someone knocked on the door. There was no answer. They knocked again. Silence. The property manager used a master key. The door opened. The air inside was stale. They found the body. The police were called. This is standard procedure. An unattended death requires an investigation to rule out foul play. The officers arrived. They were young. They didn't know who lived in 4B. They saw an elderly male, deceased. They scanned the room. It was sparse. No signs of struggle. No signs of a break-in. Just the sad, cluttered tableau of a poor man's end. They looked for identification. They found a wallet. They found a driver's license, Lee William Aaker. They looked for next of kin information. They checked his phone. They checked his papers. There was nothing. No wife, no children, no parents. The officers called the Maricopa County Medical Examiner. The van arrived. The body was zipped into a bag. It was carried out of the apartment, down the walkway, past the neighbors who peeked through their blinds. They watched the black bag go by. They didn't know they were watching Rusty leave the fort for the last time. The apartment was sealed. The investigation moved from the physical scene to the administrative one. The body arrived at the morgue. It was processed. Height, weight, fingerprints. The cause of death was determined to be natural causes, cardiovascular disease. The cumulative effect of age and neglect, but the status of the body remained unresolved. Who claims him? Who pays for the cremation? Who organizes the funeral? The investigators ran the standard checks. They searched for living relatives. They found none close enough or willing to take responsibility. The clerk at the medical examiner's office made the designation, Indigent Decedent. This label is a legal and social erasure. It strips the deceased of their history. It reduces them to a liability. The county is obligated to dispose of the remains for public health reasons, but it is not obligated to honor them. The protocol is strict. Hold the body for a mandated period, usually 30 days. to allow for a claim. If no claim is made, cremate the body. Place the ashes in a communal receptacle or a numbered box. Bury it in a county cemetery, often an unmarked field. Lee Aaker was placed in cold storage. He was a number in a ledger. He was a file on a desk. For days he lay there. The man who had been the most famous child in America was now a ward of the state. The disconnect is profound. In 1955, if Rusty had scraped his knee, it would have been news. Magazines would have covered it. Thousands of fan letters would have poured in. Get well soon cards, teddy bears. In 2021, Lee Aaker died, and the world didn't blink. The silence was absolute. This is the ultimate victory of the Hollywood machine. It separates the image from the human so completely that the human can cease to exist while the image lives on. On that very day, April 1st, 2021, somewhere in the world, an episode of The Adventures of Rin Tin Tin was likely playing. On a screen, Rusty was alive. He was young. He was saluting. He was safe. In the morgue, Lee Aaker was cold. The investigation into his identity continued, driven by the diligence of a caseworker. They ran the name again. They dug deeper into the background. The search results began to populate. Actor, child star, Rin Tin Tin. The caseworker looked at the screen. They saw the photos, the publicity shots from Columbia Pictures, the smiling boy in the cavalry hat. They looked at the intake photo of the deceased. The facial structure was there. The eyes were the same, buried under wrinkles and cataracts. The realization hit. This wasn't just an indigent old man. This was a cultural artifact, but knowing his name didn't change his status. Fame is not legal tender in a morgue. The clock was ticking on the 30-day hold, and Lee was days away from becoming ash in a generic county box. However, the fraternity of child stars watches the wires. The signal reached Paul Peterson, a former child star known for the Donna Reed Show, and the founder of A Minor Consideration, an advocacy group dedicated to protecting former child actors. Peterson understood the stakes immediately. If Lee Aaker were disposed of as a John Doe, it would be the final crushing victory of the studio system. Proof that the industry could extract every ounce of value from a child and leave nothing behind. He immediately contacted the medical examiner, identifying the deceased not just as an indigent man, but as a veteran of the United States Air Force and a cultural icon. He claimed the body. This intervention halted the county process. The status shifted from unclaimed to claimed. But claiming a body is only the legal first step. The financial reality remained. Lee Aaker died with zero assets. There was no life insurance policy. There was no estate. The cost of a funeral, even a modest one, runs into the thousands of dollars. The county would pay for an anonymous cremation, but it would not pay for a private service or a military burial. Peterson and his organization stepped into the breach. They raised the funds. They passed the hat among the surviving members of the Child Star fraternity. They scraped together the money to ensure that Lee Aaker would be handled with the respect due to a human being, not a failed product. But the necessity of this intervention revealed a darker truth. Why was a charity required to bury the star of Rin Tin Tin? The answer lies in the specific economic structure of Lee Aaker's career. He was a gig worker half a century before the term became popular. He was an independent contractor. He had no pension from Screen Gems. He had no health care from the studio. He had no residuals. The immense wealth he generated, the millions in ad revenue, the empire of merchandise, remained with the corporation. Lee was paid a weekly wage for his labor, and when the labor ended, the transaction was complete. This is the indigent reality. It is not a glitch in the system. It is the design. The industry is built to acquire youth at a discount, monetize it at a premium, and externalize the cost of the aftermath. Lee Aaker was the externalized cost. While Peterson arranged the logistics, the news of Lee's death finally broke to the general public. It was late April. The headlines appeared on entertainment websites. Lee Aaker, child star of Rin Tin Tin, dead at 77. The public reaction was a wave of digital nostalgia. Social media feeds filled with clips of the show. People posted photos of their vintage rusty toys. They commented on how much they loved him. He was my childhood. I wanted to be him. R.I.P. Rusty. But there was a profound disconnect between the digital mourning and the physical reality. The people posting tributes assumed Lee had lived a full, comfortable life. They imagined him retired in Palm Springs, perhaps playing golf, surrounded by grandchildren and accolades. They did not know he died alone in a low-income apartment in Mesa. They did not know his body sat in a morgue for 2 weeks because he had no one to call. The obituaries were dutiful. They listed his credits. They mentioned Hondo and High Noon. They mentioned the 1959 buyout contract. But few delved into the decades that followed. The blue-collar purgatory, the carpentry, the ski instruction, the relentless grinding poverty. The narrative was sanitized. It focused on the golden boy and skipped the broken man. However, the details of his end, the indigent status, the isolation, forced an uncomfortable conversation within the industry. It highlighted the utter lack of a safety net for the pioneering generation of television actors. The Screen Actors Guild today has a pension plan, but it requires vesting. You have to earn a certain amount within a specific time frame. Lee Aaker, who worked intensely as a child but sporadically as an adult, fell through the cracks of the pension system. He had the fame of a star, but the retirement benefits of a day laborer. Paul Peterson spoke publicly about this bitterness. He noted that Lee passed away alone and unclaimed. He pointed out the cruelty of an industry that remembers you only when you are profitable. There was also a deafening silence from the corporate giants. Screen Gems, now a part of the massive Sony apparatus, issued no major statement. Disney, where Lee had worked on Spin and Marty, remained quiet. To acknowledge him would be to acknowledge the disparity. If Disney or Sony admitted that one of their classic stars died destitute, it would raise questions about where the money went. It would raise questions about fairness and retroactive compensation. It is easier to say nothing. It is safer to let the news cycle churn and fade. The funeral arrangements moved forward. Because Lee Aaker was an Air Force veteran, he was entitled to a military burial. This was the one safety net that held. The United States military, unlike Hollywood, does not forget its own. He was not buried in Hollywood. Forever Cemetery, alongside the moguls and the matinee idols. He wasn't buried in a prestigious plot in Los Angeles. He remained in Arizona. The service was small. It was dignified. There was a flag. There was a bugler playing taps. There were a few people who knew him not as Rusty, but as Lee. In the end, Lee Aaker found a way to live with dignity, even when the industry stripped him of everything else. He worked, he built houses, he refused to be a victim, he died broke, but thanks to the loyalty of his peers, he did not die forgotten. Lee William Aaker, 1943 to 2021, carpenter, airman, teacher, and once, a long time ago, a star.